to start by saying thank you to the Sundance Film Festival for inviting the film to play in competition here. And we want to say this was a 3-year journey, very challenging, probably something that would have been impossible to do without the great partners we have and collaborators, some of who are in the room here, and we'd like to acknowledge them.
We'd like to thank our producers and the entire team at Sumrain, and we'd like to thank Fifth Season, and we'd like to also thank our incredible editor Keita Ideno, sitting over there, and who was a big part of this process of making this film, and also special shout out to Masaya, who's sitting there, who was also an integral part, who's been with us since the beginning.
Enjoy.
Welcome, directors Braun and Chiaki Yanagimoto. Thank you both for being here. This is such an intense story that I personally knew very little about before seeing the film. I'd love to hear about how both of you first came to know about AUM and how the project came together.
Sure. Thanks, guys, for staying for Q&A. So I am from Japan. I grew up in Yamanashi. I grew up in Yamanashi, where Kamigurishiki is. When the subway attack happened, there was of course, a big shock to the nation and big shock to the community, and it was a very vivid memory. For the long time, Yamanashi was synonymous to Onshinrikyo, and it stayed in my life. But also at the same time, as an adult, I realized that I know very little about who was AUM and what happened, what was going on, what they were doing leading up to the subway attack. So that when we started talking about this story, it was clear to me that this is a story that needs to be told and explained.
And, like Chiaki said, her approach to the story was something very personal, technically, and for me it was sort of a similar draw, but from a totally unrelated experience that I had growing up in New York, where my elementary school was next to the World Trade Center, and I was there that morning. The first plane flew overhead our school, and that's what drew me to the sort of story. I wanted to, tell something that I could relate to, the experience of going through trauma and kind of, grief for a long period of time. And when we first kind of met to talk about it, I think we felt that it was our sort of, similar yet unrelated kind of experiences that would kind of help us tell the story in the right way.
And how did you two meet?
Totally randomly in Toronto. We had a meeting about another film, and I think the conversation we were having was basically like, there's been a lot of great, Japanese docs on kind of well-known, chef or, like a cultural, artistry, whatever. But there hasn't been a great story-driven documentary out of Japan, and there really are very few well-known Japanese documentary filmmakers. And when we were talking about like, well, what could it be, we were both like, well, AUM is really the story. And we both were sort of familiar with it to a point. Felt like, as you said, like not a lot of people know this. Even in Japan, a lot of people don't really know the depths of what led up to this, and that there's a lot there to kind of dig into. And then there's of course a lot of themes in the story that I think as we kind of dug into a lot of the material, we felt there's something in this that will be relevant in today's world, whereas I think on the surface it's hard to see why that would be the case.
When you first started approaching people, was it easy to get them to talk? Were they open to talking about AUM and the incident in general?
Yeah, so that was originally my concern. One of my concerns, people in Japan, there's a reason that that hasn't been really told in Japan. I think culturally we don't really, it's a history that we're not the most, the proudest of. So we haven't really talked about it in a way that's very open and personal. And but when we reached out to people in Japan, so to our surprise, people were very willing to talk and excited to share this story, really helpful for our project. So that was one of the good surprises that we had. They wanted to tell the story, and hopefully we did our justice to the stories.
Is there still an OM contingent? There was a reference that the authorities are sort of worried about it being resurrected.
Yeah, so OM itself was ordered to dissolve right after the subway attack, soon after the subway attack. But have been splinter groups. One of them, there are two major groups. One is Hikari no Wa, led by Joyu, as you saw in the film, and the other is called Aleph. This one is more bigger and less explained, a bit potentially threatening group of those two. But yeah, the membership still exists. It's not as powerful as OM at that time, and they are. It's important to mention that they are under monitor. The government, there's a government agency in Japan that's monitoring them, so we're not in danger.
I mean, we don't think we are, but I think, as a lot of the characters in our story kind of say at the end, like, the true nature of what these groups are is a little bit unknown. I mean, Hikari no Wa is much smaller, which is the group that Joy is part of. They're under quite intensive security. They're monitored 24/7. And Aleph is the other group. We don't know as much about them. Their leadership is unknown. Even Joyu kind of said to us, like, don't go near them. So, I think we just don't know how these groups will evolve over the course of time. So we're sort of apprehensive about saying for sure, like, what the danger they pose or don't pose is.
Makes sense. Do we have questions out here? Right here in the first row, white shirt.
Hello. First off, I loved the film. Thank you guys. It was really
Thank you.
fascinating. I was really interested in when OM went international and went to Russia and their numbers just like blew up. What kind of legacy did they leave in Russia? Do you guys know anything?
So in Russia, the group, very shortly after the incident in the subway, they were kind of aggressively shut down by the Russian government and authorities. They were deemed a terrorist organization, and the nature. So what happened to their assets and their followers? It's like, the nature of the reality that the Russian government has sort of aided them, like, kind of led to effectively any result of their persecution, or like what happened to them just being really swept under the rug, because I think there was like not a big desire to like dig deeply into like how much certain people in various government entities there had helped them. So I think it was kind of like, get rid of this, don't talk about it anymore. And to this day there isn't much legacy of it. It's kind of like, there's no real trace of who was part of it there. The people who Joyu explained had aided them are all dead. So I think that's kind of a bit of a mystery.
I saw another hand in the back. Yeah.
I'm curious about the interview with Joyu, and like if you guys went into that with like more hard-hitting questions, or if it was more sort of like peaceful, or like at the end it sort of like painted him as this kind of a villain or like very culpable, but it didn't hear any like specific questions and like pointing exactly that and getting a response. So I'm curious what that was like in the interview.
Well, he's very, very he's elusive to a certain point. I think one thing that was a surprise to us is that he was, as you saw in the film, he's very direct about how he took part in what happened to Sakamoto. That is about as close as we could get to something that he was, not exactly tripped up by what we asked him, but I think he just felt sort of comfortable about being direct about it because for whatever reason he wasn't ever criminally implicated in it. But, our approach to him, essentially towards the end of the film, was to try to just get some sense of really how he personally felt about his involvement in any of this, because, the approach to try to ask him a really tough, pressing question to get some type of, it doesn't work with him. He's just a little bit too hard to get through to. And anything we would ask him to try to, trip him up or really get some sense of his deeper level of involvement, it wasn't really possible. So what we rely on is other people who sort of know, in theory, what he might have taken part of, and to present it as sort of something that's left to the imagination. But, you know, probably the most earnest thing we got out of him was the fact that he does not have any regret over what he took part in.
Yeah, just wanted to add to that. No, that's exactly what Ben said. You know, it was sort of a creative decision to portray him as he. I mean, you know, what we see on the screen kind of says it all. You know, we didn't have to push him in certain ways, and we certainly didn't have to try to portray him as more villain or more this way and that way than what he really is. So that was sort of our approach to him, to this complicated character.
Any more questions out there? Oh, yeah, right there, sorry.
Yes, arigato gozaimasu, guys, well done. I'm just wondering, was there information or footage that you really wish you would have been able to get to add to this very good story?
There were many stories that we actually couldn't put in the film. You know, this is a story that happens over a decade internationally. It's very tricky to pack everything into a feature film length. I would say some of the stories that that we heard, or that our subjects were kind enough to tell us. You know, some parts we naturally didn't have archive footage of. We decided to create an animation to those stories to portray, and you know, not having just the talking heads, but yeah, I would say it wasn't a story that we like wished we had materials. We had a lot of materials, you know, over 160 hours of footage and a lot of photographs and news footage. Yeah, we had more enough, I think.
Yeah, there was very little that what we didn't have is portrayed in animation.
Were there any big surprises to you guys, like as you started out and to the finished product?
Well, going back to the last gentleman's question, I think the surprise was actually with Joyu was that, you know, with certain elements of this, with certain parts of the story, in particular around Sakamoto, we had interviewed him twice. The first time we tried to talk to him about that story, he really gave us like a real kind of circular answer to how he took part in it, and kind of was just very evasive about it. And I think what was surprising is just like ultimately how candid he was about it. I think when we first started to get to know him, we thought he'd be somebody where there's like, he presents himself in a certain way and then there's like some twist, you know, where like, oh, he's really awful. You know, he's so candid about a lot of what he took part in that, you know, just sort of changed the direction of how his character is portrayed, in that you slowly start to kind of realize the nature of what he took part in and how there's this mystery around what he really did or didn't do, which to us, we felt was something a lot more kind of unique, and we weren't really expecting that.
Any surprises for you?
As I said, earlier, I think the biggest surprise for me personally was how open these subjects were about talking, and you know, this is for many of them very horrifying, memories, horrifying incidents that they had to go through, and they really wanted to tell those stories, and they were, all of them were saying, even in Japan, as Ben said earlier, younger generation don't even know about this. They learn about the subway attack because they read it on the history textbook in high school, but all it says is the subway attack happened and it was done by AUM. It doesn't explain who AUM was, it doesn't explain why or how, they did this, and I think a lot of the subjects that we interviewed were very happy and helpful and encouraging for us to pursue this, to tell the stories.
How did you get so much footage on that subject?
Yes, this question was about the archive materials that we had in the film. We were able to, we kept seeing, like when we were doing the research phase, we kept seeing these materials and we're like, where are they? And we got access to a lot of them through a former establishment, which is controlled by the Victims Association and this agency called PSIA, and governmental agency, and we got their blessing to use those materials in the film. And yeah, there are a lot of news fetishes, materials from media, and interestingly, or I guess one of the other surprises was, well, I guess it's not really a surprise, but obstacles that we found was we couldn't really get approval from a lot of Japanese broadcasters because they didn't want to share these materials. So some materials we have to go outside Japan, to go to BBC or Reuters, other international sources to get those media footage.
Yeah, I think that's the gist of it. I mean, a lot of the footage that you see here was pieced together through VHS tapes that the group had kept over the course of time. It was very hard to kind of track down who owned that stuff because, the former members who had some of this material, didn't legally possess it. And we found out that it was owned by a group called the Victims Association, which is like the current day iteration of the group Nagaoka had founded. And basically when we got in touch with them and said that we had come into possession of it, we sort of explained our take on the story. They felt like, it's okay to use it. So that's how we got access to it.
All right, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today, but a big round of applause for owning the culture to live in the world.
Hey, this is Eric from IONCINEMA.com. If you want to support us, subscribe below. For more reviews, interviews, film festival coverage from Sundance, Cannes, Toronto, you want to check out these guys on this side.